Hi, everyone. Welcome to this very special event. This is taking place what is normally on Insight Mediation. We are really happy and grateful to Elizabeth Sterrett for giving us this time to honor and notice Black History Month. This is one of two events that OAFM is putting on. It's lovely to see all of you. I'm just briefly going to say hello to you and then turn it over to our MC of the day, Abhijeen Skirvin. Abhijeen is a family law lawyer practicing in Toronto, an accredited family mediator, also an instructor at York University with me. And it's a pleasure to have Abhijeen here emceeing the event. And Abhijeen will get you underway. So thank you. Over to you, Abhijeen.
Okay, thanks, Marianne, and good afternoon, everyone. Good to see you here. We'll start with the land acknowledgement, the OAFM's intention statement, and then I'll introduce our guest speaker for today. So before we begin, we invite a brief pause to arrive. We acknowledge that we are gathered on lands that have long been home to Indigenous peoples, including the Anishinaabe, Haudenosaunee, Wendat, and Métis nations. These lands are connected through treaties and agreements, including the Dish with One Spoon, Wampum Belt Covenant, which speaks to shared responsibility, care for the land, and care for one another. For many of us, land acknowledgements can become familiar. Today, we invite ourselves to pause and remember that this land holds stories, relationships, and losses that are not abstract. The impacts of colonization are not confined to history. They continue to shape families, communities, and the justice systems within which many of us work. We also acknowledge the harms that have been done and continue to be done to Indigenous peoples through colonization, displacement, broken treaties, and systems that have disrupted Indigenous sovereignty, family structures, and ways of life. As people working in family mediation and the justice system, we recognize that our professions have not been separate from these realities. We offer this acknowledgement with humility and as an invitation to reflect on our relationship to the land, to the systems we work within, and to the responsibility we carry in how we show up for families and communities. Alongside this acknowledgement, we want to share our intention for this space. We acknowledge the real and lasting harms caused by racism, colonialism, and other forms of systemic inequality. In particular, we name the ongoing act of anti-Black racism and the ways Black families continue to experience disproportionate mistrust, surveillance, and harm within justice-related systems. We also recognize the compounded harms experienced by people who are marginalized because of race, culture, disability, gender identity, sexual orientation, immigration status, or poverty. These realities shape how safe people feel, how heard they are, and whether systems are experienced as protective or harmful. Family conflict and separation are already vulnerable moments. When these experiences unfold within systems that have caused harm, the weight carried by families is heavier. And so, as mediative professionals, we're often asked to remain neutral, and yet we know that neutrality does not undo harm, nor does it address power imbalances. Our work calls us to be attentive, reflective, and responsive, to notice where harm may be present, even when it is unspoken, and to design processes that prioritize safety, dignity, and voice. We offer this intention as an invitation to reflect, to notice what arises, and to carry this awareness into how we engage with one another and with the families we serve. So thank you for listening to OFM's intention statement. Moving towards introducing our wonderful guest speaker. As part of the Ontario Association for Family Mediation's Black History Month program, we are honored indeed to welcome a guest whose work brings history, place, and lived experience together in a really powerful way. Her presentation today is entitled Niagara's Freedom Trail, Exploring People, Places, and Events, and will take us across 3 centuries, 1780 to 1905, of early Black history in Niagara, Ontario, that shaped this country and changed the world. This is not distant history, it's Canadian history, local history, and lived history or living history. One that continues to inform conversations about safety and belonging and justice, which, as we know, as mediators and people working in ADR, these are deeply relevant to our work as family in the field we are. So it is my pleasure to introduce our Black History Month guest speaker, Rochelle Bush. Rochelle is a descendant of African American freedom seekers who settled in St. Catharines, where she was born. Rochelle is a trustee and resident historian of the Salem Chapel BME Church, Harriet Tubman Underground Railroad National Historic Site, and the owner and operator of Tubman Tours Canada. She's a past Historical Society of St. Catharines board director, a past board member of the St. Catharines Museum, a certified Niagara tourism ambassador, and a registered Niagara Parks tour guide. Rochelle is also a Niagara College graduate. So welcome, and we're certainly looking forward to your presentation. So over to Rochelle.
Thank you for the wonderful introduction, Avogene. So we're going to try to share this, and here we go, because I am not the best techie. So everybody can see the screen? Perfect. So, happy Black History Month 2026. Just got to get this. There we go. So Black History Month was introduced as Negro History Week in 1926 in the United States. The founder, the gentleman in front of us, Dr. Carter G. Woodson, and he's a Harvard graduate. He introduced Negro History Week as a way to uplift Black people because Ku Klux Klan, they were terrorizing Black people throughout the United States. And we all know that lynchings were prominent at the time as well. So it began as Negro History Week, and then in the 1970s, it morphed into Black History Month. So this year, in the United States, they're celebrating 100 years of Black History Month. In Canada, and this is the official theme from the Canadian government, 30 years here in Canada for the celebration, but it also began as Negro History Week in the 1950s in Toronto. So this year, it's honoring Black brilliance across generations, from nation builders to tomorrow's visionaries. And as we heard, this talk is about Niagara's Freedom Trail, exploring people, places, and events. So historians estimate that up to 40,000 African Americans escaped from slavery in the United States by way of the Underground Railroad to find shelter behind Upper Canada's humanitarian policies. Thousands of freedom seekers, also known as runaway slaves, crossed the Niagara River. And we know others crossed at the Detroit River as well. So this talk has a focus on the Underground Railroad, but as we heard, it will cover 3 centuries of Black history in Niagara. So the Niagara's Freedom Trail was introduced in 1995. So that's when it opened. So it's 31 years old. But before we even get there, let's start from the beginning. The first Black person on record, freeborn, was a gentleman by the name of Matthew DaCosta. He was an African European. Some say he may have been born in Portugal, but he was an interpreter between Samuel de Champlain as well as the indigenous peoples in the Maritimes, the Micmac. So he was a linguist. He arrived in 1605, and then in 1609, he moved back to Europe. And you can see he has a postage stamp here in Canada. So he's the first free Black person on Canadian soil. And just for this talk, I'm just going to keep saying Canada rather than Lower Canada, Upper Canada, or Canada West, but there are some points where I may differentiate with that. The first enslaved person on record is a little boy by the name of Oliver Lejeune. Born in Madagascar, captured, enslaved by a Jesuit priest in Old Quebec, and he passed away there at the age of 33, and he was actually captured in 1629. We know how transatlantic slave trade worked. Europeans would go to Africa, the West Coast primarily, capture Africans, trade Africans, put them on a slave ship, also known as the Middle Passage or the transatlantic slave trade, force them across the ocean to the Americas, and then from the Americas, other products such as sugar, tobacco, and cotton going back to Europe. Another picture or image of the transatlantic slave trade. And in North America, the primary commodity was cotton. So this is just an image of enslaved people in South Carolina from circa 1860. So to put it into perspective, the system was known as chattel slavery, meaning black people who were enslaved were deemed property. In most cases, no more important than the chair you're sitting on, your coffee table, or the family pet. So if I were to say to everybody, what does 1870 mean to African Americans? What would you say? So because this isn't an in-person session, there's no raising hands or anything like that, and we can't have the dialogue. But 1870 to African Americans means that that is the first time black people were recorded in the census with their full name. Prior to that, in the census records, you may find a blank space or a check mark. That's it. Rarely would there be a name. So the system was known as chattel slavery. People were no more important than, again, the table or the family pet. Prior to this system of African enslavement, and chattel slavery was in South America, the Caribbean, as well as Canada. So prior to this, if we're looking at ancient times or biblical times when it comes to slavery, you're looking at indentured servitude. So if somebody robbed their neighbor or stole something, they may have gone before a judge, perhaps not a jury, but for the crime, they would have to pay a service of indentured servitude. And that could range anywhere from, 1 month all the way up to 10 years, but eventually they'd go home. Slavery at that time as well. You could be enslaved for 5 years or maybe a period of 25 years, but eventually you would be released. With chattel slavery, it was for a lifetime. So if you were born into enslavement, you continued as a slave until you passed away, unless you purchased your freedom or your enslaver manumitted you. So, Niagara's Freedom Trail. This is what individuals were escaping from, and they hopped on board the Underground Railroad. What was the Underground Railroad? So, that's not Squid Games, but the Underground Railroad was a secret society. You could not stand on the street corner and say, I'm a member of the Underground Railroad, because all the participants were breaking the laws. So, what they did is they set up a system of passwords, symbols, signs, handshakes, safe houses, and they used railroad terminology so that anybody who was not a member of the Underground Railroad would not understand how they were communicating. So it was a way so that they couldn't be detected as participants in the Underground Railroad. And what were they doing? They were helping enslaved people escape from enslavement. And this was the number one form of resistance for enslavement in the United States, the runaway. So Niagara's Freedom Trail, when it opened in 1995, it had the brochure with 14 points of interest, a map showing you the site locations, and then there was a book with 32 points of interest. That's no longer in print. So people were escaping by way of the Underground Railroad. They'd make it to the Niagara River, and then they'd cross into the British colony, which is Canada West or Niagara. So everywhere you see the yellow dot, that's where the Freedom Trail is located today. So if you look further to the left where you see West Lincoln and then at the top, the town of Grimsby, we've now identified other locations so that the Freedom Trail can expand. So today we have over 60 points of interest with regards to Black history that relate to early Black history prior to the Civil War. So we'll begin at Fort Erie. Fort Erie, this is where the first foundation was laid when the Freedom Trail opened in 1995. So you can see at the top the white car and then Lake Erie in the background. And then behind Lake Erie, that's the downtown skyline of Buffalo, New York. The rock is known as the Freedom Crossing. So that's the monument there. And that's where a ferry was landing. When you look at the top left picture, you see the Peace Bridge that's crossing over the Niagara River. And then if you look at the yellow dot off to the side, that's where the rock is actually located. So that's the beginning of Niagara's Freedom Trail, starting at the Fort Erie location or the Upper Niagara River. There was a gentleman who was enslaved, and he was loyal to his enslaver because the number one dynamic of enslavement was the separation of families. That's the worst thing an enslaver or slave master could do to enslaved people. Separate the families. Again, they're deemed as property, so they have no legal rights to themselves. So this gentleman, loyal, his enslaver asked him to transport a group of enslaved people to another state. So he transported them from Maryland to Kentucky. And along the way, other black people who were freeborn were telling him to set the enslaved people free. He refused to do that. Two reasons. Number one, his wife and children were enslaved. So they were back in Maryland. They would have been abused if he would have set the other ones free. Number two, he didn't want to give up that position of loyalty because the promise was you remain loyal to me, you transport the enslaved people, you will keep your family together. There will be no separating of your family, and you would all stay with me. That's what the enslaver was promising. Well, that promise was made to this guy, Josiah Henson, and it was all a lie. Upon his return, Henson learned that he was to be sold and separated from his family. So, of course, he was furious. He made a makeshift backpack, put his two small children in the backpack, and had his wife and children walk alongside him. They made the journey, 600 miles on foot. There was no Underground Railroad at the time because it was 1830. Josiah Henson said the only people that helped him along the way, because there was no white people, there were no black people, it was the indigenous community. He finally landed in Buffalo, New York on October 28, 1830, crossed the river, and landed in Fort Erie. And that's where he remained for a number of years. Josiah Henson wanted what was denied to him, and that was a formal education. But his children were going to school. So in 1849, he decided to write his autobiography with the help of his older son. And he did. It was a bestseller, and Harriet Beecher Stowe, a leading white female abolitionist, used his character to form Uncle Tom's Cabin. So he's the model character in Uncle Tom's Cabin, and it was a number one bestseller in 1852. And it also went on to become the Tom shows. Today we know them as the minstrel shows or blackface shows. But Josiah Henson was the model character. In downtown Fort Erie, you can also go to Freedom Park. That's a Niagara Parks Commission plaque. It commemorates Josiah Henson's crossing along with his family back in 1830, along with the thousands of freedom seekers that crossed at the Buffalo Fort Erie location to gain freedom in Canada. Because oftentimes, once they made it to Buffalo or 2 miles lower than Buffalo to Black Rock, once they looked across the Niagara River, that was the first glimpse of freedom that they had recognized. Yes. So before we move on from Fort Erie, there is one honorable mention that has nothing to do with the Underground Railroad, and this is from the 20th century. That is W.E.B. Du Bois in the bottom left, and he is the first African American to graduate from Harvard. With lynchings on the rise, as well as the Ku Klux Klan, in 1905, he put out the call and he asked black men to meet in Buffalo, New York, so that they could come up with a resolution to denounce to denounce lynchings as well as the Ku Klux Klan. They crossed the border and they stayed in Fort Erie, and that's the Fort Erie Beach Hotel at the top. So it was a nice resort at the time in 1905. This organization that they formed became known as the Niagara Movement. And again, it happened in 1905. The town of Fort Erie put up a plaque at Waverly Beach to commemorate the Niagara Movement because it was extremely significant. It was the forerunner to the world's largest civil rights organization, the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People, so the NAACP. They couldn't continue with their lodging in Buffalo, New York because of racism, so they had to cross the border and complete the meetings, their conference in Fort Erie. So isn't that amazing? Canada had a hand in the formation of what became the NAACP. Niagara Falls. So this is the R. Nathaniel Dett Memorial Chapel. So up at the top left, that's the chapel and how it looked about 1880. It was normally located where the Niagara Falls View Casino is now, on top of Murray Hill. But the congregants, because it was so cold at the top of the hill, because that's the top of the escarpment, they decided to move the church to this current location at Pier and Grave Street. So it had to be hoisted on logs and then rolled down Murray Hill to its current location. So on the right-hand side, that's what the church looks like today. Again, built by African American freedom seekers, and it became a National Historic Site in the year 2000. The gentleman on the left-hand side, his name is Oliver Parnell. He escaped from enslavement from Berlin, Maryland in 1855, and he crossed at the lower part of the Niagara River. He was enslaved. He did not have a formal education, but he was extremely industrious, and he made a lot of money, and he owned property. Upon his death, the land where the current church now stands, so the R. Nathaniel Dett Church, Where they hoisted it on logs and rolled it down to its current location, that is property that was bequeathed to the congregation from Oliver Parnell. Next to him is Burr Plato. Burr Plato escaped from enslavement in 1856, so the summer of 1806, himself as well as 7 other young black males between the ages of 15 and 23. Plato was the oldest. He wanted a formal education as well, and I should say they crossed at Fort Erie. He wanted a formal education as well, and he was extremely industrious. So during the day, he operated a hack, like a taxi company, where he would pilot tourists around Niagara Falls. So both gentlemen lived in Niagara Falls, and Plato decided, and he was determined to go to school at night so that he would receive a formal education. So he was very industrious, had his own business, had a wife raising his children, and he's going to school at night. He became a respected member of the community. They really revered him to the point where they were insisting that he run for city council. And he didn't. Back then, they were all known as aldermans, but he was elected to city council, and his portrait still resides or hangs in the downtown city hall in Niagara Falls. So both gentlemen are buried at the Drummond Hill Cemetery, which is on Lundy's Lane as well. So both were members of the R. Nathaniel Dett Memorial Chapel. And here is R. Nathaniel Dett, the chapel's namesake. So he was born in Niagara Falls, Ontario, then raised in Niagara Falls, New York, because, it's just a short crossing the border, not even 2 miles difference. But that's where his mother and father relocated to. So, of course, he would have to follow suit. They lived there. He received a formal education, and you can see that he became a well-respected composer and pianist. So he had the R. Nathaniel Dett chorale that would travel Europe as well as North America. And there's still the Nathaniel Dett chorale today. He is buried in the Fairview Cemetery in Niagara Falls, Ontario. So the entire family, even though they relocated to the United States, short distance away, Niagara Falls, New York to Niagara Falls, Ontario, they all insisted on being buried in Canada. Yes. So he's still a famous composer, and his music is used worldwide today. What's famous about Niagara Falls? This crossing location. So this is the railway suspension bridge. It opened in 1848, but in 1855, they added the steam engine train. So you can see at the top left, the horse and buggy at the bottom of the train. So at the bottom or on part of the bridge, people could also cross by foot. But in the background, that is Niagara Falls. So the location is at the corner of Bridge Street and the Niagara River Parkway. So that's where it was located. And that, of course, is customs and immigrations. But there's also an interpretive panel for this because it's Harriet Tubman's only documented crossing point coming into Canada. In 2017, children from the Harriet Tubman's Public School, so from grades 2 to 5, petitioned the Niagara Parks Commission to have them commemorate Harriet Tubman's crossing point into Canada. So we don't know where she crossed prior to 1856, whether it was Buffalo to Fort Erie or whether it was Lewiston to Queenston or Youngstown, New York to Niagara-on-the-Lake. But we do know after this account, she made her way, so December 1856, to Canada, and she continued to cross there all the way through until she relocated to the United States. Queenston. So it's also known as Queenston Heights. This is Queenston Heights Park. So you can see at the bottom image, on the left-hand side, a good view of Brock's Monument, but that is the Niagara River flowing into Lake Ontario. In the land on the right-hand side, of course, is Lewiston, New York. The top picture, so that's a fantastic aerial shot of Brock's Monument. So again, the park is not a National Historic Site, it's a provincial historic site, but the importance of it, that's also General Brock's gravestone. So it's about the Battle of the War of 1812. So the entire area is sacred land. So this is where Americans were trying to invade our homeland, and this is where British soldiers, British officers, as well as the Colored Corps took up arms. So with the Colored Corps, they were fighting British officers. During the War of 1812, some men were older, so such as Richard Pierpoint, and we'll discuss him further. He was 68 years old at the time he took up arms because the loss to black men, if the Americans had won the War of 1812, would have been their freedom. White men, they would have lost their nationality. They would have become Americans once again because for the most part, they arrived as white loyalists, and they left the United States. So they decided that they would fight during the American Revolution for the crown. But they would have become Americans had the Americans invaded Canada. They did not. So the colored corps was raised, so the provincial marker is there, as well as the national marker. So for the Black Militia, that was formed between 1812 all the way up to 1850. But what's also important, fighting alongside British officers as well as the colored corps were Indigenous warriors. So there's no more going to Queenston Heights Park without honoring the Indigenous warriors or soldiers that were there as well. So this is the Landscapes of Nation Park or Memorial, and it's one of the most significant memorials for Indigenous people in the province of Ontario. 1793. So we do know that when slavery was abolished throughout the British Empire, and between 1793 to 1834, the highest concentration of enslaved people in Upper Canada was in this area. So Queenston as well as Niagara-on-the-Lake. So you can see two enslaved women, and then you can see the white male smoking his pipe or whatever it is, but while he's standing on the stump, but then you can see the bullwhip in his right hand. 1793 is significant because of Chloe Cooley. So when the American Revolution ended, white males who were British loyalists were permitted to bring their property to Canada, Upper Canada with them. A lot of that property were human beings. Chloe Cooley was one. She arrived with Benjamin Hardison, and she was first enslaved in Fort Erie. But Chloe Cooley was difficult. She was belligerent. She was unruly. She would fight her enslaver. She just wouldn't listen. So he had enough of her, and he decided that he was going to sell her to another enslaver by the name of Adam Vrooman. Adam Vrooman was a white loyalist, and he also fought during the American Revolution. And he received 100 acres of land out in Niagara-on-the-Lake. So I just want you to view this image and look at the waterway. It's flowing, Niagara River flowing into Lake Ontario, but it's the boat that we're looking at. Because these white loyalists who were living in Canada learned that this guy, the Lieutenant Governor John Graves Simcoe, who also fought alongside them during the American Revolution for the crown, they learned that he was coming to be the first Lieutenant Governor of Upper Canada. So Simcoe's fighting alongside these white loyalists. They come to Canada with their enslaved humans, and he moves back to England where he becomes a member of Parliament. Then they decide to divide the country up, Upper Canada to Lower Canada. He takes the position to be the first Lieutenant Governor for Upper Canada. All the men who had enslaved people, they're whispering, thinking that Simcoe's coming to abolish slavery, because back in England and prior to the American Revolution, he was a staunch abolitionist. He was hard then, and he wanted to abolish slavery. But the American Revolution, him witnessing the horrors and hardships against Black people who were enslaved, made him even harder. So he was determined to come to Canada and abolish slavery. So what did they do? They start selling off their human property. So Vrooman had Chloe Cooley bound and gagged. So it was himself as well as 3 other men tying up Chloe Cooley, putting her in the boat, selling her to a New York enslaver. Nobody ever heard from her again. Nobody knows her fate. But what happened, because Chloe Cooley was unruly, she would fight back. And she was screaming. 2 people heard the screams. They brought the information back to the Lieutenant Governor, John Graves Simcoe, and he used it to start the debates to try to abolish slavery in this British colony. It ended up being a compromise. So in 1793, it was the Act to Limit Slavery. The debates began in March, and then it reached royal assent in July. So what this act meant was those who were enslaved would continue with a life of enslavement. Their children would be set free at the age of 25. Their grandchildren would be born free, but it meant no more importing people of African descent into this British colony to be used as slaves. And it also meant that anybody who was enslaved in the United States, once they escaped slavery, if they landed on British soil, so whether they crossed at the Niagara River or the Detroit River, once they set foot on British soil, they were automatically free. So, of course, a law such as this would outrage the United States, the Americans, and it changed the trajectory of enslavement all around the world. because it was the first piece of British legislation to start abolishing slavery, even though it was gradual. It was the first one. So again, that's Queenston, Niagara-on-the-Lake. That act to limit slavery was printed on that Louis Roy press that's at the bottom. That's a wooden press. There's only 7 in existence all around the world, and that printing press is at the Mackenzie House in Niagara-on-the-Lake. And of course, there's the image of the Mackenzie House, and you can find that location right along the Niagara Parkway, and you can see Brock's Monument in the background. Well, if you're riding along the parkway, when you see this national plaque and this brick wall, the stone wall, that's where Chloe Cooley was enslaved. So anywhere in that section along the Niagara River, she was bound and gagged and forced over the river and sold to a New York enslaver. So again, the first piece of legislation that changed the trajectory for enslavement globally. Chloe Cooley is a person of provincial importance. She has a heritage minute. She also has a postage stamp, and she was recognized in 2024. So the federal government designated her as a person of national importance, and they erected this national plaque for Chloe Cooley at the base of the Queenston-Lewiston Lookout. So Chloe Cooley is the first person of African descent and the first person recorded that the government has acknowledged was enslaved. So this is their first time, 2 years ago. The first person that I mentioned who was enslaved in Canada, Oliver Lejeune, the little boy, he received his national commemorative plaque in October 2023. So he is the second person. So it's just now, within the past couple of years, that the Canadian government has acknowledged that enslavement, African enslavement, occurred in Canada. And we know that it still has not happened in the United States, and they're on a mission to erase it. 41 years later, we have the Slavery Abolitionist Act of 1833. Took effect August 1st, 1834. So the call came out in July 1833. The Executive Council met, and it took 1 year for the debates. And that's because white enslavers in the Caribbean wanted to be compensated for the loss of their human property. 20 million pounds was paid out, but depending on which site you go to, some say it's shy of $1 billion today. But the last British family to be paid out, they wanted the compensation for the loss of their human property. The last British family to be paid out, 2015. You can Google it. So imagine the size of that plantation and the amount of people who were enslaved for that family to receive their last payment in 2015. Yeah, The Guardian carried a big story about it. It was just awful. So August 1st, 1834, that's when it took effect. Celebrations began 1 year later. Niagara-on-the-Lake. When the British invaded this British colony during the War of 1812, they eventually sacked Fort George, burned it down to the ground. So now the soldiers have nowhere to meet. They used the Colored Corps to quickly assemble this garrison known as Fort Mississauga in Niagara-on-the-Lake. You have to cut through Niagara-on-the-Lake's golf course, which is the oldest golf course in all of North America, to get to this location. Once you get to the reverse side, there is a breathtaking view of Lake Ontario, the Niagara River, and Fort Niagara, which is directly across the river on the other side, the US side in Youngstown. So again, constructed by the Colored Corps because the Americans burnt down Fort George. Another significant event took place in Niagara-on-the-Lake in 1837. This guy is known as Solomon Mosby, so it's just a depiction. He escaped from enslavement, his enslaver in Kentucky, by stealing his enslaver or slave master's horse. Somewhere along the line, whether it's Buffalo or Niagara Falls, New York, he ditched the horse, made his way to Niagara-on-the-Lake. So he's here in May. His enslaver finds out where he is. His enslaver's name was David Castleman. So he arrives, it's later in May, and he's asking the sheriff to arrest Mosby. Well, the sheriff can't do it because of the act to limit slavery. So Castleman retreats. He's over the border for about a week, but then he returns and he has a new plan. And he says, well, I want him arrested because he stole my horse. So the sheriff doesn't know what to do. It's a totally different charge. So he arrests Mosby. And Mosby is detained in the courthouse. So the courthouse is usually doubled as jails, but it's also where the aldermen or council met. So the council chambers. So he's detained there from June all the way to September because the lieutenant governor at the time, Sir Francis Bondhead, he had to wait for a decision to be rendered from the Queen's Council in England because we were still a British colony. So they had to wait for that, and the decision was eventually rendered, and it was served in September of 1837. But prior to that, everybody's familiar with Black Lives Matter, and we know that half of the members of Black Lives Matter are not Black. They're white people because they're supporting Black folks, they're allies, and they recognize all the injustices that occurred. So the same thing was happening here in Niagara-on-the-Lake. So the courthouse is surrounded because nobody believed that the sheriff would not transport Mosby across the border under the cover of darkness, especially if he was offered money. So it's September. Queen's Council renders a decision. The sheriff's smart. He enlists some of the militiamen from Fort George. They make their way to the courthouse. They tell the crowd that Mosby must be returned to slavery. And of course, once Mosby comes out in shackles and he's placed on a wagon, the riot begins. So the first riot in Upper Canada, black and white, with regards to this injustice. So Herbert Holmes, who was a black school teacher, he's the first one to be killed. So he's shot. One of the militiamen, they shoot him in the head. His friend Jacob Green, he has like a fence rail. He uses it as a spike to put between the wagon wheels so it can't move forward and they can't move Mosby. He's stabbed to death with a bayonet. Mosby, who's in shackles, somehow manages to disappear. So there's 400 people out there rioting, so 400 people that were trying to save Mosby, plus the militia and other law enforcement. Mosby escapes, he makes his way to England, and then eventually he makes his way back to Niagara about a decade later. Sensitivities around the language. There used to be a plaque that commemorated more of the courthouse rather than the Mosby story. But about 4 years ago, the Ontario Heritage Foundation revisited that, and now it's known as the Solomon Mosby Affair. Because again, what happened with Mosby was extremely significant when it comes to Canadian laws. So today, attorneys will still cite the Mosby Affair for extradition cases, deportation cases, as well as immigration cases. So with Mosby, with this, nobody could be extradited after this incident. One person slipped through the cracks, and his name was Nelson Hackett. Outside of that, no. You had to go before a judge and jury, but they certainly were not going to return any person who escaped from enslavement from the United States back, no matter what the charge was, horse stealing or not. This location is Mary and Mississauga Street in Niagara-on-the-Lake. Where the arrow is pointing, that is where there's a cemetery. And some of you may be familiar with it. During the pandemic, it became the most racialized incident across Canada because there was a gentleman from Toronto who was protesting the area. There's a couple of gravestones in there, but legend has it that city staff was allowing the gravestones to fall over and allowing the earth to swallow them, or some of the local residents were literally taking the stones as trophies or to use them as foundations for their patios or their barns, whatever they were using them for. What we do know, according to the documentation, is that Herbert Holmes, as well as Jacob Green, the two men that were killed during the Solomon Mosby affair, are buried in that location, but their gravestones are unknown now. So the markers are gone, and what they're trying to do is raise enough money so that they can erect the stones that are under the ground, as well as change a lot of it. So it's more of a tourist attraction. But what happened, it's controversial again. It was once known as Negro Burial Ground. So in Niagara-on-the-Lake, you cannot stop a boat or a motor coach. It has to drive completely through the town. You can't park it anywhere unless it's at Fort George. So on a bus or in a car, you would be able to drive past this marker and you would be able to identify it as a black burial ground. Well, again, because of the language and the sensitivity issues, the Ontario Heritage Foundation changed the plaque. Now it's known as the Niagara Baptist Church Burial Ground. The only way you're going to know that people of African descent are buried at that location is if you park somewhere, get out of your vehicle, and literally read that marker. So it's controversial once again because it's now not identified. So myself as a tourist operator will drive past it slowly and I'll say, formerly known as Negro Burial Ground, but still tell the story. But that's how it is right now. So it was controversial a couple of years ago and it's still controversial today. What's important about Niagara-on-the-Lake because they're in the forefront with regards to Black history in Niagara. 2018, they introduced Voices of Freedom Park. So it's a 60 to 90 minute walking tour in Niagara-on-the-Lake. Just depends on how fast you want to go, but there are 14 points of interest that you will learn about Black history. So you can either download the brochure or you can download the app, and it's a lovely walking tour. St. Catharines. So the first person of African descent, I already mentioned, Richard Pierpoint. So he's the first person on record in St. Catharines and possibly all of Niagara. So Richard Pierpoint was born in Bandu, Africa around 1744, captured, forced onto a slave ship in 1760 when he's about 16 years old. Then the American Revolution begins. He's enslaved. Lord Dunmore gives out the call. Any enslaved black men who want to fight for the crown during the American Revolution will gain their freedom after the war. Pierpoint does exactly that. He starts off as a soldier, a red coat, British uniform. The British introduced military camouflage gear, the green coats. Red coats, you couldn't blend in the forestry, you're visible. Green coats, you're blending with the forestry. So now Pierpoint is a ranger. That's what the green coats were known as. Queen's Rangers, King's Rangers, or Butler's Rangers. Now, these individuals were the ones that take no prisoners. So think in terms of today's Black Ops, Navy SEALs, Delta Forces. You go in, you kill everybody. Women and children, collateral damage. So what? You loot the town, you burn it down to the ground, you take whatever you can, you move on to the next one. Well, we all know that if that happened in warfare today, you're going to be court-martialed and you're going to prison. But we're talking about the 18th century and the 19th century, and things were pretty bad then. Pierpoint, we recognize him as a stealth killer. Why? He was only a private, but at the end of the war, he received 200 acres of land, the same as white British officers, whereas other privates, black and white, only received 100 acres of land. So Pierpoint was well respected. So first black settler in St. Catharines, and that's pretty much what St. Catharines looked like when Pierpoint was here, or what it was developing into. Richard Pierpoint also fought during the War of 1812. He was 68 years old when he approached the British to raise the colored corps, and they eventually relented and said yes. So Richard Pierpoint has a provincial marker. He also has a national marker. He has a heritage minute, and he has a park in St. Catharines named after him. So part of the 200 acres that he owned is now part of his land. So he has the second largest park named after him in St. Catharines, and it's the first public space in all of Niagara to be named after a person who is non-white. And that happened in 2021. Frederick Douglass. He's on record of being in St. Catharines 9 times. Frederick Douglass said the Underground Railroad that he connected with ended in St. Catharines. He said it had many, many branches and it started in Baltimore, but again, ended in St. Catharines. And this is St. Catharines circa 1860. So this is what it looked like when Douglass was here. And of course, one of the most famous residents of the town during the 1850s was Harriet Tubman, but we will get to her. 1850 changed everything because that's when the U.S. government introduces the 1850 Fugitive Slave Law, also known as the Fugitive Slave Act or the Fugitive Slave Bill, but it was also known as the Bloodhound Bill. This law caused tens of thousands of African Americans to relocate to Canada to secure their safety and freedom. So whether they were freeborn and living in the free states and they had their manumission papers to prove that they were freeborn, or whether they were already runaway slaves, freedom seekers, impersonating free people living in the northern states. So this law changed everything. The majority came to Canada, again, and this is because the law turned the northern free states into a haven for slave catchers. It was passed by U.S. Congress, which was controlled by Southerners. But the president at the time was Millard Fillmore, and he was born in a free state, New York, and he was born in Buffalo, New York. What this law did for northern white people, So for the most part, Northern white people ignored slavery. It was coffee table conversation or dinner table conversation because they weren't walking out of their front door and witnessing enslaved people. They weren't seeing the horrors and hardships. They only heard about it or read about it. This law stipulated that they must help law enforcement. So let's pretend you're a white family and you're living in Ohio. You've lived next to your black neighbors for 20 years, and now a U.S. Marshal is knocking on your door, and they are alleging that your neighbors are runaway slaves and they ask for you to help them arrest them. If you say no, here's your $1,000 fine. We're going to seize your property, and you can go to jail for up to 6 months. Overnight, this 1850 Fugitive Slave Act turned hundreds of thousands of white Northerners, not tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of white Northerners into anti-slavery activists overnight because they did not sign up to be slave catchers. So there was a lot of pushback, and we know what happened 11 years later. Civil War, but there were other events that took place in between. This is the image of a freedom seeker or the runaway slave who was placed on the wanted posters. So this is from 1837, but after 1850, this became the prominent image on the reward posters. And there's also a female counterpart as well. In the North, what abolitionists would do, both black and white, black folks, if they could read and write, they would put up these broadsides to alert people that slave catchers were in the area. So you can see at the bottom image. Black man's being dragged out of his house by a slave catcher. His wife is standing behind, begging for mercy. His little daughter's at his knee, the slave catcher's knee, begging for mercy for her dad as well. But right behind the slave catcher, the white man in the yellow shirt, doubling up his fist because they were against the fugitive slave laws as well. And Frederick Douglass, he said the only way to end the fugitive slave law was to make it a dead letter, and that was by shooting slave catchers or shooting law enforcement just to prevent them from apprehending you and returning you to a life of enslavement. But we can see that there was a lot of agitation and anger for Northerners. So again, Harriet Tubman had to extend her Underground Railroad route to Canada. Tubman, as we know, is the most famous figure of the Underground Railroad. She was born in Dorchester County, Maryland, around 1822. Her name was Araminta Ross, nickname Minty for short. She was enslaved until 1849 when she escaped, leaving her loved ones behind. And that included her husband as well as her parents and siblings. Excuse me. So then she hopped on board the Underground Railroad, made her way to Philadelphia in 1849, and then she first arrived in St. Catharines in December 1851 with 11 freedom seekers, and she remained until early 1862. So Harriet Tubman is a person of provincial importance in St. Catharines and a person of national importance. In fact, she's the first person to be recognized as a person of national importance in two countries, Canada and the United States. And her designation in Canada came in 2005. Harriet Tubman was a devout Christian. So we know that she communicated with God on a daily basis, and this is according to her narrative. She was also 5 feet tall, roughly 100 pounds. She had a constant headache because when she was a tweener, she was instructed by her enslaver to accompany the plantation cook, to the dry goods store. They get there, and there is an overseer who's trying to apprehend a young black male, and he asked Harriet for help. She said no, she blocked his path. He picks up a 2-pound weight, and he throws it at the young man. It misses him, and it strikes Harriet Tubman in the left temple. For the rest of her life, she has a piece of skull pressing against her brain, and she said there was always a buzzing going off in her head, the constant headache. She would often black out or pass out. They called it sleeping spells back at that time, but scholars and physicians today understand that it was seizures and that Harriet Tubman was an epileptic. So it was known as temporal lobe syndrome. Her code name for the Underground Railroad was Moses because, of course, if it was a secret society, nobody was going to use their real name. She had a hoarse voice in 1855 on the road to freedom. She had to wade through the water twice, so 2 streams of water with 2 young black males. She stops in Wilmington, Delaware, where Thomas Garrett documents her account. That's in May 1855, and she doesn't return again until September 1855. So she's recuperating here in St. Catharines. And Garrett writes that Harriet Tubman lost her feminine voice. Now she sounds like a man. She had up her front teeth missing. In 1858, she met a little boy by the name of Oliver Phelps Jr. Excuse me, Wendell Phelps Jr. 30 years later, he's recounting his first meeting with Harriet Tubman, and all he can remember were her jagged teeth. In her narrative, On the Road to Freedom, she said she had an offending tooth, so she took a rock and a little piece of pipe and popped it out. Took it out herself, just to, relieve herself from the toothache. She also carried a pistol. So she had a crossbody bag where she carried a pistol, and she carried the Bible and a panagoric. So she was a naturopathy. The panagoric was this little concoction that she would rub on babies' gums to keep them quiet. Because if they were crying or screaming, of course, slave catchers would hear them, and that would be their giveaway. Their hiding space would be no longer. So the pistol, she carried that for two reasons. Those who were weak and weary and wanted to go back, she would threaten them. A dead man tells no tales. Go on or die. Because if she allowed them to go back, they would turn in the entire network. Everybody would be arrested. The second reason why she carried the pistol, she said, no one will take her back alive. When it is time for me to go, the Lord will let them kill me. So she was planning a shootout with slave catchers. This is the most recent discovery of Harriet Tubman, this image. So it was discovered in 2018, and it's now owned by the Library of Congress and the Washington, D.C. African American Museum. And that's Harriet Tubman 6 years after she leaves St. Catharines. So this is the church that she attended. It's also the church that I attended. I attend today, excuse me. But that is how it kind of looked when Harriet Tubman was tending it. Plank boards. So the Salem Chapel is a National Historic Site as well as an International Historic Site because it was built by African American freedom seekers and its connection to Harriet Tubman. My connection to this church, my 2 times great-grandfather was the minister in charge for a period of time when Harriet Tubman attended the church. So for me, it's a long family legacy. Salem Chapel is a National Historic Site, and it's also an International Historic Site. We're the first church that was listed on the National Park Service Network to Freedom, and that's a U.S. agency. Wrapping it up now. This is Reverend Anthony Burns. He was enslaved in Virginia, 1854. He's about 19 or 20 years old. He decides to escape. He makes his way to Boston. In Boston, he's employed as a tailor as well as a baker. 1854, he makes that fatal mistake when his enslaver is hunting him down. He acknowledges him. So his enslaver was Charles Suttle. He stops him on the street. Burns acknowledges him. He's arrested and he's taken to the courthouse. Boston had a lot of these broadsides posted everywhere, alerting people, letting them know that kidnappers and slave catchers were in the area. The day that Burns was captured, this broadside went up quickly. A man kidnapped, meet at Fennel Hall. It was for 7 o'clock on May 26. 2,000 people appeared. They're rioting in the streets. They storm the courthouse. They try to free Burns. They do not. 2 people are killed. 5 days of rioting, like Black Lives Matter. Now it's President Pierce. He's enforcing the fugitive slave law. It cost the U.S. government $40,000. When you look at this, so people are rioting in the streets. President Pierce hired 2,200 men, law enforcement, the cavalry, you name it, newly deputized citizens. These were to guard off the rioters and guide or walk or transport Anthony Burns to the harbor to return him to slavery. So on the top, those are snipers on the rooftop. When you look on the sides, you can see militiamen, soldiers with their rifles, and then, of course, officers on horseback in the front. One black male to guide him, return him back to enslavement. And that's because Boston was the hotbed for radical abolitionists. 50,000 people out on the streets rioting. Everybody heard about it. It was global news. They even wrote a book about it during the 5 days, the Boston Slave Riot. Anthony Burns is returned to a life of enslavement. His friends do not forget about him. They eventually purchase his freedom. He's set free. He decides to attend Oberlin College in Ohio. where he receives his degree in theology. 1859, he moves on to Indiana. Well, when the white people there finally learned who he was, they ran him out of town. They did not want him agitating the black people, the free blacks in that community. Zion Baptist Church here in St. Catharines was without a pastor. So Anthony Burns makes his way down here. It's July 1860. Zion Baptist Church is in financial ruin, and that's because the two previous ministers were stealing from the coffers. And one had to be replaced because they found out he was a bigamist. Embarrassment to the church. So both ministers are fired. Anthony Burns takes the position. In 2 short years, he turns the reputation and the debt around of Zion Baptist Church. That Zion Baptist Church, how it looked when Anthony Burns attended it. Unfortunately, it was demolished in 1958. The congregation still survives, but they meet in this little home on Raymond Street. So it still continues today, but they have about 12 members there. So Anthony Burns turns the reputation and the debt around of Zion Baptist Church back in between July 1860 and July 1862. And then he passes away at the age of 28. No wife, no heirs, and he's buried in Victoria Lawn Cemetery, part of Niagara's Freedom Trail. So he's the most famous figure out there. Four of African Americans, four white men in 1962 decided that he should be commemorated. So they had the Ontario Heritage Foundation erect this plaque, the Anthony Burns plaque, at the front of the cemetery gates. The first person of African descent in the province of Ontario to receive the plaque. Yes. The end. Thank you so much.
Wow.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Rochelle. I
You're
think
welcome.
we all have to go on to Tubman Tours Canada. I need to hear this presentation another
Oh,
time
thank
for
you.
sure. This was
Oh, thank
definitely
you.
powerful, very eye-opening for me, and certainly left me, and I'm sure others of my colleagues here for sure, with seriously a much greater appreciation for the legacy, right, of freedom seekers. So thank you so much. And
Oh,
what
thank
we've
you.
heard here, yeah, heard here is a living example, I feel, of how people in conflict and so on in transition found ways to communicate with each other, to listen and create safe spaces. And this is what we do in mediation, right? We strive as well to create safe dialogue spaces and to help people move from pain and understanding and crafting resolution and so on. So thank you so much. Those stories, I'm sure, will encourage us as practitioners to honor the voices and to build trust and foster understanding in our communities. And yay to Black History Month. So thank you so much. And thank you all for
Thank you for
coming out.
having
And
me.
oh, for sure, it was a pleasure. And we learned so much. Marianne, shall I turn it over to you?
Sure, absolutely. Thank you so much, Rochelle. I think Abhijit, you said it so well. I absolutely would love to go on a tour with you. It sounds like you're so knowledgeable and really, it was a wonderful presentation. So thank you so much.
Thank you.
We welcome everyone back. Next week, we are hearing from Ujima Family Mediation Center and continuing our learning together and collaborating and with always kindness and love in our hearts. So thank you so much. I hope that you have a
Thank
wonderful
you.
rest of your day. And
You
I
as
look forward
well.
to seeing you next week. Thank you.
Thanks again, everyone.
Thank
And
Thank
you.
thank
you.
you, Rochelle.
Bye.
Thank
Thank you so
you.
much.
Bye. Bye.
Thanks. Bye, everyone.